and could change from Monday to Tuesday. So if there's a change in policy, if these people who I've told you are trickling it out, if they think they can tolerate another bunch of them at once, then a bunch of people who haven't gotten notices of default will get them all at once. So that period of non-payment, we don't know, but once the foreclosure starts, that we know.
I mean, I agree with your statement, I don't know, but to let you know, I know of situations where notices of default have been posted as much as 2 years ago, and the lender has never finished up the foreclosure.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Once the notice of default is posted, then they don't have to file the notice of trustee sale 90 days later. They don't have to conduct the trustee sale 30 days after that, and they don't have to evict you 30 days.
Now why they are not doing this is beyond me.
And the answer I'm giving when I say 5 months is because the preponderance, the vast majority of people, once the notice of default is done, the vast majority are foreclosed in 4 months. But you're right, there is a substantial minority who are not. But as a realtor, telling someone how long it's going to take, I think the last thing you want to say to them is, oh, it could be a couple of years after that, or it could be longer. You have to say, that legal process, once started, will take 4 months, and you won't own your house anymore. And you can say, I've seen some go longer, but I wouldn't chance it. I'd count on 4 months.
So the minimum you can say is the minimum is going to be 5 months.
The minimum is 4 months before you no longer own, and another month before you are physically dispossessed of the premises.
After the notice of default.
After the notice of default is recorded with the Los Angeles County Recorder. That's the law. It can't be shorter than that.
I'm in the process of a short sale right now, and someone recommended that when that final letter does come from the lender, that your office, someone at your office should look at it to make sure the language is correct and lets them off the hook.
Question is, do you need a lawyer to look at the final lender letter? I'm always reluctant to, I mean, look, we make our living practicing law and selling our time. I'm always reluctant to say that someone needs a lawyer in some generic circumstance. There are plenty of lender letters that are so clear, that it says that if this short sale closes escrow, then the borrower will owe $0.00 or will owe no more money at all, or the loan will be deemed satisfied, or will be deemed paid in full, or satisfied in full. There are so many of those letters that don't need to be reviewed by an attorney that I don't need ever to look at. If you've got one where it's really vague and ambiguous, and your client is pressing you saying, well, does this mean it's over or it doesn't? Or if you realize that you don't know and they may think that it's over and it may not, then it's probably a good idea to have a 1-hour consultation with us, and you can bring your clients in and be there with them. But I wouldn't make it as a universal rule.
But then, let's say if the language is not good and favorable, then you'd be hired, and then you'd send a letter to the lender saying this client does not.
No, because it really ends up, once you have that from the lender and it isn't negotiable and you're not going to be able to get anything better in the letter, now it's a business decision that has to be made by the seller saying, would I rather go through with the short sale, or would I rather lose the property in foreclosure, or I suppose the third alternative, can I reinstate the loan and just keep the property? Which is difficult because if they're in contract to sell it, they may not even be able to do that.
So you're saying you're in negotiation with the lender, and you say the lender is unacceptable to my client. I mean, you're going to call and say it's unacceptable to my client, and then the lender's either going to say, okay, we'll change it, or no, we're not. And
Correct.
That's what you're stuck with. If they're not going to change it, then you have to make a business decision whether you want to go forward.
That's exactly right, Jack.
Should you have some language then, if you're representing the seller in the transaction, that says if terms are not acceptable by the seller, or if lender's terms are not acceptable by the seller regarding payoff, the seller has the right to cancel.
Yes, if you can get that negotiated into your offer and acceptance, then it's brilliant, because then the seller can say, okay, just kidding, I don't want the short sale.
It's already in the
addendum.
It's in the short sale addendum.
Yeah.
Yes, it's in. No, that's the language we're talking about.
It's in the addendum.
If you're using the SSA, the CA or SSA, it's in there, and it is in the seller's.
That's mandatory.
Yes, and I'm going to suggest, is that a rule here? Because my suggestion is use the SSA in every single short sale, always, no exceptions. The only argument I've ever heard from a realtor as to why it shouldn't be used is because it takes too much trouble to fill out the extra form. That wasn't a good argument.
If you're representing the seller, and you're in escrow, and another agent brings an offer higher, what do you do?
So you've got the property in escrow. You've already applied for the short sale lender to accept $700,000. Now all of a sudden you get a new offer from a buyer that says that they'll pay $800,000. What do you do? The answer is you disclose that to the lender, and you disclose it in writing, and you have to. What will happen is when you take that to the lender for the $800,000, they may then say, okay, we'll approve it at $800,000. You go back to the original buyer who's in escrow and you say, the sale has been approved at $800,000. Would you like it? No? Okay, goodbye. Now back to you who offered $800,000. Would you like it? And now you have a sale.
But do you,
Can the
do you
first buyer pay, let's say the first buyer says $800,000.
Yeah?
Can the second buyer, then you just tell the second buyer he's out, or does the second buyer,
Yes.
can he come up higher?
No, the second buyer, no, because what happens is you have an agreement, you could, but it's dangerous. If you have an agreement with buyer number one,
What I'm trying to find out, Steve, what I'm trying to find out is how does the agent, if I'm representing the seller, how do I not have any exposure?
here's how. When you have let's say the contract is at $700,000 with buyer number one. Let's say that potential buyer number two offers $800,000. You take that $800,000 offer, you make buyer number one aware of it, you make the lender aware of it. You wait for lender approval. When the lender approves, if they approve at $700,000, there's no decision to make. That buyer has it at $700,000, you sell it to them. If the lender approves at $800,000, you turn to buyer number one and you say, they've approved at $800,000. Would you like it? Yes? Great, close the deal. No? Great, you're out. Now let me call buyer number two. It's been approved at $800,000. Do you want it? Great, close escrow. The key is disclosure. Disclosure will set you free.
Steve,
Now, why
when would
do you
you
need-
disclose to
why-
buyer?
Hang on. With it, Jim or Jack?
Oh, you gotta go with Jim.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what obligation do you have to disclose? What is the source of the obligation you have to the lender to disclose the higher offer?
Okay.
If you're under contract, what is the source of that obligation?
Litigation avoidance. The answer is it's that simple. There is no law, and it's a fair question. There is no law that gives you as the listing agent the responsibility to the seller's lender to do this. The reason that I am recommending it is because this is not a discussion of how to win when you get sued. This is a discussion of how to practice real estate without getting sued. And that's the key here. And when you make these quote-unquote unrequired or unnecessary disclosures, what you're doing is you're protecting yourself, you're protecting your clients. And so that's the source of it, is just avoiding trouble. Where was I? Was here. Go.
So sharing the desire to avoid litigation, and picking up on John's example, do I, as the listing agent, have an obligation to tell buyer number one that I've now submitted a second offer to buy to the bank?
Yes, absolutely. Not only do you have an obligation to do that, but you also want to do that because buyer number one's response might be, no problem, I'll do it for $800. And then you've saved, what's happened is that person has gotten another $100 for the lender. Doesn't help or hurt your seller, but it increases the chances of the sale being made to buyer number one. Way back.
Second buyer come back and say, you go back and tell the second buyer, hey, listen, we've already, in the escrow, he's made it $800. The second buyer, can he say, I'll go $820? He can do whatever he wants.
He can
Say
keep
$825.
offering more, and if he keeps if buyer number questions, what happens if you then go back to buyer number two and say, gee, we told buyer number one and he went to $800. If buyer number two says, I'll go to $900, you say, great, let's just keep going. Because first of all, from your selfish point of view, this increases the chances the deal's going to get made and a real estate fee is going to occur. You want that. The second thing that it does is it increases the chances that the lender will be happy and satisfied and that you'll be able to get other things that you need in the negotiation with a lender. The third thing it does is it takes your seller and puts them in a position where they're much less likely to go in foreclosure. This is all good. It also indicates that prices are rising, which is also good.
What about the terms of the offer? Let's say we have $700,000
offer that got accepted from a very qualified buyer, 50% down and so forth. We take it to the bank. Another offer comes in, 100,000 more, but 20% down, the property's not going to appraise, could be contingent on something.
You present that to the lender. You present it to the lender, but you have to explain it to the lender. Here's why you have to explain it to the lender. The lenders are not real estate people. The lenders are not business people. The lenders are finance people. This is like saying they're from another planet. They think differently, they look at things differently, and they could easily miss the difference that you described that everyone in the room understood. The lender might not understand that. It requires an education. So when you present that this is now 800, it's not 800 with 50% down and a well-qualified buyer. It's something that won't appraise. We think it's bad. We're sending it to you just so you'll be aware of it, but we don't think it's a legitimate offer. We think you'll end up foreclosing if you approve at 800. But this buyer at 700, we have tremendous confidence in. But we're sending it to you because we think we should. Ma'am.
The potential tax consequences for me would be the ultimate reason to continue submitting offers to a lender, because I don't know what the tax consequences will be for a seller. And so consequently, I want all offers presented to the seller until the lender says, don't give me any more.
Correct.
Maybe. Because the tax consequences cut both ways. There are two different tax consequences. The one you're thinking of is relief from indebtedness income. You're 100% correct. The other one that nobody's thinking about is capital gains. There are people who bought the property for $100,000 decades ago who have refinanced, and now they're doing a short sale with $1.2 million against it. When they do that short sale and they take their exemption, they're still going to owe $300,000 in tax for the capital gain, not the so the higher the price, the worse it is for that. The lower the price, the worse it is for the other. So again, don't guess. Talk to the CPA. Have your client talk to the CPA. It's a great example of where what we all think we know about taxes is it's best left unsaid. It's best letting them do it right there. Ma'am.
Can you explain what happens when a seller decides to go BK during this process?
When a seller goes bankrupt during the process, all executory contracts in which they are involved are subject to cancellation by the trustee or by the debtor in possession. So if a seller in a short sale decides to declare bankruptcy, they don't have to, but they have the option of canceling the short sale contract that you're in. Who's next, ma'am?
Now, the agent is working for the best interest of the seller or of the lender. Let's say the seller says, no, don't tell the lender I have an $800,000 offer because that's going to cost me more in capital gain tax. What is your responsibility toward the seller?
Your responsibility is toward the seller, and your responsibility to the seller is to tell the seller, look, I know you feel that way, but you've got a lot of problems here. We got a short sale. I know the economy hasn't been kind to you, but what we don't want you to suffer is any hint that you may have defrauded a federally insured, federally chartered lender, because that's a felony. And the last thing you need on top of a foreclosure is a prison sentence. So, in your best interest, we need to disclose.
Place to live in.
Ma'am.
At what point is the debt done? So in other words, what words from the bank or letter from the bank says, okay, we've got enough offers, or when does it stop?
It doesn't stop until there's a short sale approval. And then there's an old saying in real estate, there's nothing like a closed escrow. So it doesn't stop until the short sale approval comes out. And when that comes out, now you better close escrow. Sir?
What if you have a seller who's encountered your services to represent them in a short sale? It's an income property. They're generating income. They probably are not claiming that income to the bank, and they're using the short sale process just to
milk the property.
Milk the whole property.
And your
out.
question is?
And going back to the responsibility to the seller. You've entered into a listing agreement with this individual that you're aware of fraudulent activity.
It's not fraudulent. It's a breach of contract, but it's not fraudulent. Where a person, an owner of short sale seller of a property has a tenant who is paying, or 300 tenants who are paying them the rent, there is a deed. If you look at your deeds of trust, they're called deed of trust and assignment of rents. The lender has the ability at any time to go and place a receiver in the property and get all that rent. And if the lender elects not to, and they won't ever in a single family residence, they won't ever in a duplex, triplex, fourplex, the smallest I've seen is about a 25 unit building. And the reason is the receiver costs about $15,000 a month. So if the rent is much less than that, they're not going to bother doing it. But you as the realtor have no duty to give instruction one way or another with respect to keeping rent or turning it over to the lender, at least as a partial payment. A lot of lenders won't even accept a partial payment. If your client asks you, is it okay for me to take the rent and keep it while not paying the payments, that's one of those times when you say, why don't you call Stephen Spierer and have a 1-hour consultation, I'll go with you, we can figure this out. And then I can explain to them the breach that they're guilty of and what it means and what it doesn't, but that's not advice you want to give. But no, you don't have a duty to stop that at all, because the lender has very clear rights in that situation. It's not a matter of disclosure. The lender knows it's an apartment building. Ma'am?
If the seller has deferred maintenance that the buyer's lender is required to fix before closing, who pays?
The buyer's lender requires repair before closing.
Like floor coverings.
Right. So this is one of those where the buyer turns out to be willing to pay more than the price that was submitted. So what you have to do, if it's long before the seller's the seller's lender has given short sale approval, you're in great shape because you put it in a disclosure to the seller's lender saying, this is what the buyer's lender is requiring, the buyer is willing to do it, we want to make you aware of that. The place where you have more trouble is if afterwards, after the lender's approval, the seller's lender has approved the short sale, if now all of a sudden it turns out, which means to the extent you can, get all that to happen early so you can disclose it. But if it happens later, then you're in a position where you have this issue, and what you need to do is make disclosure in bold, plain, clear language to the seller's lender, and then put it on the HUD-1 at the close and so forth. You do the best you can with that. Would I blow a deal over it? No. But would I lay a clear paper trail to the seller's lender so when someone comes back and says you committed this thing, the answer is no. I have it in letters, I have it in emails, I sent it up in smoke signals, I did everything I could to make sure seller's lender was aware of it, and then I think you're fine. But it's got to be really bold and really out there, and it isn't once. It's do it and send it again, and if you don't get a response, say, here's a copy of the previous correspondence, I just want to make sure you've gotten it, and so forth. You want to be big and colorful about it. Sir?
What about strategic default?
Strategic default, and then we have time for 2 more questions, and then I have to run to a meeting where I'll be defending a realtor in a transaction who could have avoided this entire thing through simple disclosure of physical defects and didn't. And so just bear that in mind. The answer on strategic default is this. There are a lot of people who can pay their payments, and let's say they owe $800,000 on a property and it's worth $500,000, and they can make the payment, but they'd rather take the hit on a foreclosure than to do this. That is a person who definitely, especially if they owe a second and a third, who needs to have a consultation with a lawyer, and the reason is that some of those loans are recourse and some of them are not. I will not ask for a show of hands because it'll be an embarrassing answer. Don't raise your hand, but think in your head, do you think a loan is non-recourse because it's purchase money? Because if you do, you're wrong. It has to be 3 things. It has to be purchase money, and it has to be 4 units residential or less, and it has to be owner-occupied. So if it was a refi, it's out. If it's a rental, it's out. If it's 5 units or more, it's out. there are all kinds of anti-deficiency legislations that apply, and there are now 4 categories of anti-deficiency legislation, which are pretty complicated, that give people immunity. But some HELOCs are non-recourse, and some hard money loans are full recourse. And so you need to, anyone doing a strategic foreclosure needs to know if their loans are actually recourse or not, and they need to know what their credit damage will be, and they need to know what their tax consequences will be. One here, and then one more question. The gentleman in the back, go.
When you said owner-occupied, is it at the time, or is it owner-occupied for the first
Good. The question is, when you have owner-occupied, what was real? And this is the same question as when you're applying for a loan. Is it owner-occupied if I closed the deal, slept there one night, and never lived there again? Or is it still owner-occupied if I lived there for 18 years and then moved out? Or does it need to be owner-occupied at the time of the foreclosure? And here's what it boils down to. It's eye of the beholder. The rule is, you go back to the big rule of justice, which is that courts look to and promote good faith behavior according to reasonable standards. And so what it's going to be, it's not going to be a matter of the position taken by the seller or the borrower. It's going to be a matter of what a trier of fact decides. Was it really your primary residence? If it was really your primary residence, then you probably have immunity. The place where it gets more complicated is where it was your primary residence for 28 years, and then you rented it out, and now it's being foreclosed on. Most of the authorities, meaning the case authorities, say that that still was your primary residence, but there are some that don't. And so it's a matter of negotiation with the lender. It's unclear. It's unclear. And the last question of the day, sir.
Yeah, if you represent the seller and you have 2 or 3 offers, is the seller supposed to sign acceptance of any of those when you send them to them?
You have 3 offers, you said,
Okay.
and then...
Does the seller need to sign the contract as accepting?
Does the seller need to sign the contract as accepting? If you represent a seller, and your preference would be that they not be legally bound, okay? But that is entirely up to the lender, and that is differing from lender to lender and from Monday to Tuesday. I'm going to tell you by now, most of the lenders want to see a signed live contract that hasn't expired and is legally binding. But there are still some lenders who are perfectly willing to consider a transaction where there is no binding contract, where it's either expired or it never existed to begin with. But they're in the increasingly smaller minority. Final comment. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I very much appreciate your questions. I love coming to this office. South Bay Brokers is the best. It's wonderful. Second, practice safe sales.
Thank you.